Good morning. I've been working in media a long time. I built websites for the San Jose Mercury News and CNET. Also worked in social media, building a news blog down in Half Moon Bay, working in community news. And overarching all of that, really I've taken an analytical approach, working as an analyst at IDC and Jupiter Research. So it's really exciting for me to come to Dow Jones and to be able to apply some of these analytic techniques to a broad range of media. Dow Jones Insight is a analytical database built on top of Factiva, which is our traditional media database, large publications, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, television organizations, and so forth, the traditional media that we all know. To that, we've added additional web sources. There are certainly web sources inside of Factiva. We've added tens of thousands more web sources, and social media as well. And we're using text mining to enhance the metadata that we already have. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the metadata that's available through Insight. And then we score stories on favorability, of course, and really take that information. I'm going to show you how we take that favorability, which we're doing in an automated fashion, and really apply weights to understand what we're doing. So we're using the press, websites, blogs, and adding on Twitter, message boards, and user reviews. If you think about the kind of volume that we're dealing with here, this dot represents about 100 stories. 100 of these is going to be 10,000 stories. We review about 1 million stories a day for each of our clients. And you can see there's a tiny orange dot in the upper left-hand corner, which represents, again, about 100 stories. Those are the stories that we're analyzing for a relatively large customer in a typical day. We take those stories, we pull out competitors' issues using our text mining platform. We score the story for favorability. We have the source information already out of the Factiva database to allow filtering and analysis, comparison, and trending. But we really want to go beyond counting stories, right? Because low-quality stories and low-quality sources can dominate in a database. So this is the typical traffic for a consumer brand we've all heard of, who's a client. And you can see here that in a month, probably half the traffic was on Twitter, which is not, that information is really important. It's an important signal, but on the other hand, there's a lot of really low-quality information in there as well. Long-tail blogs, there's a lot of junk. I've reviewed a lot of this stuff. A lot of it is not really very useful. There's a lot of spam out there and so forth. Message boards, confusing discussions going both ways, really difficult to evaluate. And then you get into some of the more substantial sources, such as newspapers, trade press, magazines, A-list blogs, mid-tier blogs, which are tremendously influential, and reviews. The traditional media obviously still matter. They're authoritative, they're well-defined, they're measurable, influential, they drive the social media conversations. So the question is, how do we weight between these two different types of sources and separate the wheat from the chaff? The cranky guy on the bulletin board is really very important, obviously, when you're looking at someone like Netflix, and I'm going to be talking about Netflix again as well. But on the other hand, when you're actually measuring favorability and measuring the amount of coverage that you're getting, it doesn't have the same weight, say, for example, as a personal testimony in a major metro daily. And those things still have to be balanced when you're analyzing your communications. So how do we calculate IMI? The Insight Media Index is a number that is based on a combination of favorability and the impacts on the story. We've got a tremendous amount of metadata. I'm going to talk about the metadata that we have available to us. Favorability is on a scale from negative 10 to 10, where favorable is a 10, unfavorable is a negative 10, and a neutral story is a slightly positive story. Every number that I'm going to show you here is settable by the client. So in fact, if they have a different view of how favorability impacts their business, they're going to be able to set these criteria and change them in their platform. And I'll show you a bunch of the other criteria that we're going to be able to put weights to as well. Because the other impacts are really the ones that have to do with the story itself and who it's reaching. So for example, placement. We have a lot of information in our database about placement. How often does the story mention the client? Where in the story are they mentioned? Are they mentioned the headline in the lead paragraph? Is there an illustration with the story? Was it on B1? Or was it buried in the back of the paper? And was it a signed review or an editorial? We can collect information about the message. Does the article mention any of the messages that are important to the client? Do they share that article with the competition, or is it exclusively about them? Is a spokesperson from the organization quoted? The message strength, does it cover any one of their core issues? Is it by a targeted journalist? We have all the information. We have information on all the journalists. We have a database. They're able to say these are the journalists that we're most interested in, and these are the ones that we want to apply an additional weight to. Does it fail to mention certain issues? Are there certain issues that you don't want to see mentioned in a story about you? So we can provide additional weight to the story if those negatives are not mentioned. And finally, consider the source. So, is it a top-tier source? Is it a middling source? Is it an A-list blog? Is it the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times? Is it an important trade publication? Or is it a source that you don't care about? I had one client where there was an entire community of detractor blogs who were all talking to one another. And we looked into it, and none of these guys are all they all basically are saying the same things. They're all talking to one another, and they're not getting a lot of traction in the marketplace. So although these are important things to maintain an awareness of in computing your actual score for your performance, they may not be the most important thing to evaluate. Is it in an important geographical market? Our database is worldwide, so we can actually narrow it down to individual countries and say these are the countries where the impacts are most important. We're also analyzing stories in 22 different languages and can segment the information in that way. And finally, how wide is the distribution? So if it's a major circulation newspaper, a trade magazine, or a website, we can calculate that as well and apply weights to those. So let's take a look at a couple of examples and see how they work in the real world. For example, a positive story by a named journalist in a targeted paper would have a favorability of 10. The accumulated values of the impacts, again, these are all settable by the client. So if they wanted to, for example, set a major metro daily at a higher value than 10, that would be something that would be an option that would be available to them. You multiply the impacts by the favorability and you get a score. A negative story in a small town newspaper, the favorability is comparable, same absolute value, it's a negative 10, but on the other hand, the impacts are significantly less. And we're able to evaluate these stories as they go through the system on a daily basis, and so you've got real-time information on all these impacts. Now, a single score in isolation is not all that useful. It's pretty arbitrary. You can assign these numbers yourself. You have some information about the relative impacts, and you want to assign values to those. And really the key is relative impact, right? In isolation, it doesn't matter. But on the other hand, in comparison, you could start to say you could compare one score to another. You could create benchmarks for your products. You could plot changes over time. I'm going to show you some trends for a couple of companies you've heard of. You could compare your score to that of a competitor, and you can compare a competitor's score over time, so you can watch trends. The advantages are that it weights the factors that matter most to you. That it's not one size fits all. It is not simply comparing, trends in the marketplace devoid of any association of what the impacts are or what your media strategy is. That it's a consistent methodology, that every day the stories are scored in the same way, and it's a way that you've chosen. It creates a standard yardstick, it makes comparisons much more simple, and it shows trends as they're happening. So let's take a look at a couple of case studies. You see here, this is Apple Computer. This is straight-up coverage. This is number of stories over the last year. And interestingly, the peak for the last year for Apple was during their Worldwide Developers Conference. There were a lot of announcements associated in particular with the upcoming version of iOS. And so there was a significant amount of traffic. And then the launch of iPhone 5 actually generated less relative traffic than did the WWDC, which is kind of surprising. So what happens if we weight the significance of the coverage by some of these factors? And these are basically using default weights that are built into IMI. This is a sample database we created. You can see here a couple of things. So 0 represents, 0. That's, straight up neutral. You can see here now that the WWDC traffic has declined significantly, that a lot of that traffic was probably from insignificant sources. A lot of that traffic, or a lot of that coverage was also probably more neutral. And that now certainly the iPhone 5 spikes. The other thing you see is that there was a significant negative score in the weeks following the iPhone 5 announcement as the impact of the change in the Maps technology on the iPhone began to set in. And there was a lot of discussion in the press about what was happening. And as you're probably aware, in fact, Scott Forstall, who was in charge of the Maps on iPhone 5, is no longer with Apple as of yesterday. So this is a major change with significant impact. Obviously, everybody was aware of the story, but on the other hand, this is a way of actually quantifying what's happened. Netflix. Different presentation of a similar story. July 11th, Netflix stock was at an all-time high. On September 15th, they announced that they were going to unbundle into a product called Quickster and said they were going to lose 1 million customers. On October 10th, they canceled Quickster. And you could see here that they were in pretty positive territory, even shortly after the announcement. But things declined quickly as the price announcement back right after the 11th of July. And then on September 15th, after they unbundled Quickster, all hell broke loose. The IMI score was fluctuating wildly. Now, I plotted this against, stock prices and so forth. I'm not sure that this information necessarily has any predictive value, and I'm also not certain necessarily that what's happening in the media is the signal that went wrong for Netflix. That in other words, really what we saw here in these quick changes, these announcements, the fact that they were unable to secure the Twitter handle for Quickster was in fact Netflix, which seemed like a very sound company, suddenly over the course of about a month and a half revealed to the market that it had no strategy. That in fact, all hell was breaking loose. They were very confused. They were cycling back and forth between announcements and strategies, and in fact, they also had a deadline coming up with one of their major suppliers, which was going to greatly affect their ability to serve their customers, a factor over which they really didn't have a lot of control. And they were really struggling with a message to come across. Now, they communicated their plans not very well. They also probably did not do the right thing, but on the other hand, what you see here is that as they gained control of the situation, recovered from their slip-ups, by the end of the year, the IMI had already been recovering. And in fact, this year they've been pretty much in line with historical averages, generally positive and slipping into negative territory from time to time. Finally, Yahoo. Another company which has had a lot of difficulties. They have had years. This is a company for which I have a great deal of affection. They've had, simply years of what a lot of people would describe in retrospect as rudderless management. And they got a break. They got a huge break. On July 16th, they hired a very senior executive who was very well regarded from Yahoo. And in fact, what you can see here is they went from, wildly oscillating IMI scores over the course of the last year to go into relatively positive territory. And the jury is certainly still out on what's going to happen with Yahoo. It is a huge enterprise to turn around. But what you can see here is that, in fact, this, positive coverage and the amount of coverage that they're getting has made a significant difference in the score for Yahoo. So again, the advantages, it allows the customer really to weight the factors that matter most to them. They're able to go in and really determine, what media and what types of messages are the ones they want to track. The methodology is consistent. It's a standard yardstick, and it makes comparisons very simple. And it shows trends while they're happening. I mean, these things are obviously computed as they happen, and we're able to provide them with information right away. I've got some time left over from questions if anybody would like to ask some.
That's a little easier. It sounds like a lot of the model that you're using is based on input from your clients, which is customizing for your clients is great. The question is there any way of testing that and tweaking that model going forward compared to different weightings of how this goes forward?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of ways to do it. I mean, I built a spreadsheet where you can take a sample database of stories and plug the proposed values in and see how they affect it. And it really is going to be very different for a client where, for example, I'm working with a major construction company and I'm also working with a CPG company. And the kind of weights that they're going to apply to media and messages are going to be obviously significantly different. So that's one way. Also, once you plug the values in, you can go back and retrospectively look at how it affected your coverage in the past. Make sure that it's consistent, with your experiences and expectations, so that going forward you're going to have confidence in the numbers that you get. So yeah, it's not only modifiable, it's testable both in short turnaround and longer turnaround situations.
So for your clients who make these weights themselves, is there a time where they adjust those weights as time goes on? Maybe they put more emphasis towards social media or less, and how's that change kind of going forward?
That's certainly an option. We tend to review platforms at least quarterly with clients because they have, they're changing their messages, they're changing their product line, the competitive matrix is changing, and so we're always looking at what factors are changing in the marketplace that the customer wants to track. And so that level of, interaction with the customer is really important. And we're certainly going to be, looking at these things as we go forward and make sure that, the tracking over time matches your expectations. And so that, and also, you talk about, changing weights of media. Think about the changes in, say, the last 18 months of the emphasis on social media and how important that is. You're going to be wanting to change those weights as well with respect to that, just because the relative contributions of these two media or these various types of media are going to be changing. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you.